It's been a bad year for universities, with speakers shouted down, students intimidated, and individuals hounded into submission for trivial or non-existent transgressions. So how can so many smart people stand by while academia is destroyed by fanatical bullies? That's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. In 1927, the French intellectual Julien Benda published Treason of the Intellectuals. It was an attack on those intellectuals who had, in his opinion, betrayed the life of the mind by immersing themselves in contemporary politics. He called his moment in history, quote, the age of the intellectual organization of political hatreds, end quote. Of course, Benda couldn't have known how prescient his words would be. The roiling ethnic grievances and passions that Benda deplored eventually resulted in the horrors of the Second World War. And now we are seeing something similar, a corruption of academia by sanctioned hatreds. We've all heard some of the outrageous stories of cowardice and betrayal of principle. Today I will briefly review two of them, one very well known, the other less so, and make a plea for men and women of conscience to stand against this corruption. Now, most of you will remember the Tim Hunt scandal from just over a year ago, in late June of 2015. The Nobel Prize-winning scientist whose investigations into cell division had played a key role in cancer research. That noble man lost his honorary position at University College London and was forced to resign from the British Royal Society following a Twitter campaign orchestrated by a third-rate journalism instructor with a very dubious CV. Connie St. Louis of City University London tweeted out only half of what Sir Tim had actually said during a luncheon toast at a science journalism conference, implying that he was a misogynist. Well, we all could have predicted the self-glorifying outrage of feminist scientists who took to social media to pat themselves on the back for being such plucky women in a harsh, male-dominated world. But one person in the drama exceeded even my jaundiced expectations of academic opportunism. That was Tim Hunt's self-declared friend, fellow scientist, Nobel Prize co-recipient, and president of the Royal Society, Sir Paul Nurse, who refused to defend Hunt in the immediate aftermath of the scandal, except to say that he was a, quote, lovely man, and who asserted that Hunt's, quote, chauvinism had to be condemned because his statements had, quote, harmed science, end quote. Well, I would have thought the harm to science was in supporting a culture willing to sacrifice brilliant male researchers on the altar of feminist rectitude. I would have said that the harm to science was in the obvious double standard, that Sir Tim was hounded out of his position for what turned out to be the most mild-mannered of comments, while Connie St. Louis never even had to explain why her online CV was full of misrepresentations and why she tried to destroy a man who had done more for science and for the social good than she would do in 10 lifetimes. This is cultural suicide in the guise of protecting women. And yet the guardians of science don't even seem to care. The issue Sir Paul wanted to talk about in interview after the scandal was not what the appropriate response should be to his so-called friend's words. What he wanted to talk about was his, Sir Paul's, devotion to the great God of diversity. Perhaps because he was terrified of being struck down in the same way Sir Tim had been and quite willing to sell him out as an act of propitiation, Sir Paul shrugged off the attack on his friend and focused on puffing the Royal Society for its so-called progressive views. He mentioned that although the society, quote, can come across as old-fashioned, end quote, because members stay on for life, it's really very feminist, he tells us, quote, half of the council are now women, and we have a lot of initiatives to improve diversity. We have a diversity committee and allow mothers or fathers to work half-time, end quote. Well, I'm glad to know that, aren't you? What a progressive idea to promote science, encouraging scientists to work half-time. Don't go at it too hard. Don't devote all your time and energy to your work as men like Sir Tim used to do. That's behind the times. Go on, change some nappies, and while you're at it, be sure to serve on the diversity committee. We can see that Sir Paul's evident ability in science has been superseded by his adeptness at parroting the Women in Science party line. Well, but at least Sir Paul's betrayal could be explained as a bid for self-preservation. And I also wonder if what sometimes happens with these scientific white knights is that having spent most of their nerdy lives peering into a microscope, the impulse to chivalry in an instant like this, even when the damsel in distress is not particularly damsel-like, is nearly irresistible. But it's more difficult to understand another example of suicidal political correctness on my side of the Atlantic, this time at San Diego State University, this past April 2016, when in one of the most remarkable and underreported episodes of campus intimidation, the president of the university, Elliot Hirschman, issued a groveling apology to pro-Islamic radicals who claimed he hadn't done enough to, quote, protect Muslim students on campus. The students were so concerned about the supposed vulnerability of Muslim students that they confined the Jewish university president to a police car for somewhere between 1 and 2 hours before essentially forcing him to declare his repentance. What was their beef? Well, these students involved with various campus Muslim organizations that promote the claims of Palestinian victimhood had been outraged by a poster campaign at San Diego State linking the names of certain radical students with Palestinian terrorism, saying that they had allied themselves with terrorists to spread hatred of Jewish students. I can see why they were upset, and the remedy was pretty straightforward. Counter the claims, put up their own posters, and look into suing the poster's creator for defamation. These students, however, wanted something splashier than that. They wanted a statement by the president denouncing the posters as a grave threat to Muslim innocence and calling for the posters' removal. When President Hirschman was slow to respond and then declined to carry out their demands, as surely it was well within his right to do so, perhaps he has more pressing matters to deal with, like running the university, well, the students then escalated the situation. An open letter was written, professors became involved, and the president was widely criticized for failing to express appropriate outrage over Muslim victimhood. Then the climax of the episode came on April 27th when a crowd of the concerned students surrounded a police car carrying Hirschman to his car after a university meeting. The fact that he had police escort at this point suggests that he was already feeling the heat of their well-orchestrated anger. But the presence of the police didn't even deter these students. They refused to allow the police car to proceed, some by spreading out Islamic prayer mats and calling on their God of mercy. After about an hour, some reports say closer to 2 hours, Hirschman was finally able to emerge from the car, offering to meet with some of the students at a later date, which was more than I think I would have done. But they told him that he wouldn't be allowed to leave unless he issued an apology on the spot. This he did, saying, quote, "If we have done things inadvertently that have upset or hurt people, we are sorry for that," end quote. There must actually be more to this scantily covered story than I was able to discover. Certainly, it is flabbergasting that the president of a university so clearly mistreated and insulted would emerge from a car where he had been essentially held captive, stand surrounded by students who wouldn't allow him to pass, and augment his humiliation with an apology to his captors. Why did he not order them off his campus? More to the point, perhaps, why did the police themselves not arrest the protesters for their evident crimes of obstruction of a police vehicle, intimidation of a university official, unlawful confinement? Did the police actually pressure or advise the president to placate the angry mob? Or did the president himself instruct the police to do nothing on the grounds that it would look too bad to arrest Muslim students and their allies? Whatever went on to produce that apology, it was an unsettling image of total submission to a mob. But are we particularly surprised by any of this? No. So why do so many university presidents seem to be reading from the same playbook? Why are so many academics quick to placate campus bullies and liars, thus guaranteeing that even more bullies will arise and that their bullying tactics will become even more aggressive? Don't any of them have any principles or a backbone? The real question, alas, is why we would expect anything else. If one looks to history, one learns that totalitarian movements have often found not only obedient but also enthusiastic adherents amongst members of the intellectual class. It turns out that intellectuals are prone to willing ideological servitude, as are, of course, many other members of society, but intellectuals are particularly vulnerable once they betray their mandate of disinterested inquiry. When I got my first tenure-stream job at the University of Saskatchewan, I thought I was entering a paradise of free inquiry in which faculty members would vigorously debate ideas. Instead, I entered a timorous culture in which individual faculty members lived in terror of being accused of racism or sexism, allowing themselves to be bullied into supporting programs and policies they didn't even believe in by a few aggressive colleagues playing their social justice cards. Living in that department, I realized for the first time in my life how communist totalitarian movements swept through those societies that found themselves behind the Iron Curtain after the Second World War. How it happened that people betrayed their neighbors, even members of their own families, in order to ingratiate themselves with the regime. I understood the incredible power of group thinking, the deep desire of human beings to be part of what C.S. Lewis called the inner ring, and the willingness of many to do just about anything to consolidate their positions there, even if it meant betraying their friends, as Sir Paul Nurse did to Sir Timothy Hunt, or selling out the students they had pledged to teach and lead, as Elliot Hirschman did when he apologized to radicals who held him hostage in a car on campus. These are deeply dispiriting times for those who care about academic integrity and fairness. And I want to call on all people of good conscience to take back our campuses. In the next video, I'll look at the situation of the German universities in the 1930s as they readily fell in line with Nazi ideology. And I'll consider what this tells us about the situation now unfolding at our universities. If you're as dismayed by all of this as I am, please don't stay silent.